Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have online with us Secretary of State Kris Kobach, friend of mine. He's been on this show before back in February. He's the 31st Kansas Secretary of State, sworn in January 10th, 2011, reelected last year. He has been active in politics, served in the Justice Department in the Bush administration, been very active on the issues affecting America in the way of immigration, illegal aliens, and is also very much involved with protecting vote integrity. Secretary Kobach, welcome back to the Joe Miller Show.
Great to be back with you, Joe.
Kris, have been trying to fight the good fight in different areas. You've been doing a very effective job in Kansas. We're trying to do some of the same sort of things up in Alaska, although vote integrity in Alaska, not really, that seem to be mutually exclusive there. We haven't had much headway over the years, even though we've got all sorts of issues. We're still using an antique Diebold machine, and we really don't have much methodology by which folk can check up on what's happened, but that's a subject for a different segment. I wanted to talk about your efforts on vote integrity. You have been fighting the federal government for some time. One thing that you wanted to make sure of is that people that want to vote in Kansas, they need to make sure, the state wants to make sure that they're citizens. Can you tell our listeners what you did to try to do that, and then what actually happened with the federal government response to that effort?
So Kansas is one of 4 states in the country that requires proof of citizenship when you register to vote. And I believe every state should be doing this. And if your listeners are interested in this, they should absolutely be calling their state representatives in Alaska and telling them to get on this and adopt something like the Kansas law. There are 4 states that do it: Kansas, Arizona, Georgia, and Alabama. And it's absolutely essential because aliens are being registered both accidentally and intentionally. And every time an alien votes, it cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen. And that's really important, especially in close elections. Anyway, we adopted this law, implemented this law in 2013. And there was one little loophole that we had to close, and that was, 99% of the people, when you register to vote, you'll use your you'll use your state form, or in Kansas, we use the Kansas registration form. But there is this federal form floating around out there that was created by the feds back in 1993, and we are required to accept the federal form, which has a separate instruction page for each state. And this federal agency that controls the form is supposed to, whenever a state changes its laws, is supposed to change the instruction page to reflect the new requirements of the law. So we asked this agency, would you please change the instruction form so that now it says you have to provide proof of citizenship in Kansas and Arizona? And much to our dismay, the federal agency said, no, we don't like proof of citizenship. And by the way, the Obama Justice Department was in the driver's seat. They were basically pulling the strings for this agency. And said, no, we don't think it's necessary to ask voters to prove their citizenship. Never mind that it has nothing to do with what the federal government wants. This is the state's right under Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And so we had to sue this agency, and then that suit was actually suggested by a Scalia Supreme Court opinion from a couple of years ago. Anyway, we sued them. We won in district court. We got a liberal panel of judges in the Court of Appeals. We lost in the circuit court. And we wanted to go to the Supreme Court, where if we had gotten there, I think we would have won pretty easily, even with things being as bad as they are in the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, the court did not take the case. They only take about 2% of the cases that are offered to them. And for whatever reason, they didn't take ours. And as a result, we are now still fighting this federal agency in our effort to exercise our sovereign right as a state to determine who is qualified to vote.
Pretty shocked. The Hill actually entitled their article about this, "Voting Rights Advocates Get Win at the Supreme Court." This is a voting rights case? I mean, this helps. I mean, I just don't get it. It seems to suggest that, we wouldn't just open the floodgates to everybody that's not qualified to vote. That seems to be the impetus here. You made the comment that the way the Supreme Court is obviously implying that you're disappointed in last week's decisions. I had a guest on this program a couple of weeks ago that commented on the pending at the time King versus Burwell decision. Yeah. And she said, hey, we got good news. We got Representative Gosar in Arizona that's proposing legislation once the Supreme Court strikes down the subsidy provision of Obamacare, because it's obvious the Supreme Court's going to do that. I mean, the language was so clear in the law, right? Yeah. In consideration of just the outrageous decision, Roberts, of course, doing what surprised many of us in actually upholding the administration. Are you really quite certain that the jurisprudence is being applied by what we used to call moderate to conservative justices? Are you convinced that it hasn't changed? I mean, I think that there's been a change in approach almost.
Well, I think two things have happened. Justice Kennedy has shifted to even further to the left than he already had. And I think it's hard to exactly explain what's going on with Chief Justice Roberts. There may be a little bit of trying to please the Washington elite crowd and the New York Times readers, but I think he also seems to be very deferential to Congress. So whatever Congress evidently wanted back when Obamacare was passed, that seems to be what he's after. So, if we had gotten our case to the Supreme Court, I think we still would have gotten a victory. Probably the liberals, the four hardcore liberals, who are, I believe, results-driven. They look less at the law and more at who they want to win and go that way. But I think we probably would have gotten Kennedy and Roberts had we gotten there. But, yeah, I think something troubling has happened on our court, and, that should have been an easy victory. To give you an idea of how everybody was assuming that we, meaning the challengers to Obamacare, were going to win, I was on a conference call last week, the day before the decision came down, of state elected leaders across the country with Paul Ryan and a few other members of Congress who were laying out what the Republican plan would be, to fill the gap immediately and then over the long haul to abolish Obamacare. I mean, everybody assumed we were going to win because the law is so clear. It said exchange established by the state. Nobody could foresee that the court would say exchange established by the state actually means exchange not established by the state. Mm-hmm. But that is the world we live in, where the court will now apparently read the statute to mean 180 degrees the opposite of what it says.
Turning back to the proof of citizenship issue, there probably is a federal legislative fix to this. Obviously, you need a president had a little sympathy for this, but this is not an area of agency discretion, is it?
No, it's not. And this agency is called the Election Assistance Commission. This agency doesn't even have the authority to write regs when it comes to qualifications for voting, write regulations. I mean, it's an agency that is charged by law with cooperating with state election officials to make sure that what's on the federal form, when you register to vote using the federal form, reflects what the state requirements are. And the idea that they have the normal, some agencies do have discretion to interpret law, but that they would have the discretion to decide what is necessary and what is not necessary for a state to do to ensure that citizens vote, only citizens are voting, is just outrageous. That, an unelected agency, and by the way, Joe, this agency didn't even have any commissioners. It's supposed to be populated by 4 commissioners, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. Didn't even have any commissioners, just had an acting executive director who was basically being coached by the Obama Justice Department to do whatever the...
So totally bureaucratically controlled.
Oh, yeah, and controlled by a hyper-partisan Department of Justice.
Wow.
Congress had created a bipartisan agency which was supposed to have virtually no power whatsoever to make these kind of decisions. Instead, it became a hyper-partisan monster, Department of Justice, without any commissioners on it.
Well, Kris, we only have about 30 seconds left. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about some of the pending litigation that you've got going on. Do you have time to stay with us, talk about those?
Yeah, sure. Be happy to.
Great. Kris Kobach, Secretary of State, a warrior on the front lines on a number of different issues, vote integrity, immigration. Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. We'll be back after these messages.